Hi there all, and thank you for joining us this morning. We'll be starting in just a minute or two. We've just got a few more people filtering in at the moment, so we'll just give it a minute and then we will get started. So yeah, won't be long at all before we get going. Thanks. Okay, I think we've had a number more filter in at the moment, so we should be good to commence. So thank you for joining us this morning. This is a session, and we do regularly sessions such as this in terms of kind of an advisory kind of a call. The focus of today's session is really kind of zeroing in on supporting those customers that are looking to kind of push those final hurdles or work through kind of areas of the estate where you're really looking to kind of finalize that push of Windows 7 over to 10 across the NHS organizations that we've been supporting throughout the periods of time where this has been occurring, but also as we start to run up to the extended deadline of January 2021 as well. We are working with a number of kind of trusts and other organizations, so I thought it'd be a great idea really just to help share some of the thought processes and changes of approach that others have found useful and that hopefully you will find useful as well. So for today, you've got two speakers from Power On. You've got myself, Phil Mercer. So I'm the managing director here at Power On, but also I tend to be very hands-on. So my thing is I really enjoy working with customers, helping them. So I do have my standard strapline of saying that I'm technical but not the techie, but essentially tend to do a lot of work supporting customers in terms of planning, thought process, how they might be moving from one system to another, and otherwise really. So really supporting in that kind of initial planning and execution phase, as well as just kind of giving oversight across different moving parts as we continue. I'm joined by my colleague Steve, and Steve, would you like to say hello?
Hi everybody, good morning. Thanks for joining us on this call. My name's Steve Beaumont. I'm the CTO at Power On Platforms. I'm responsible for everything that is kind of strategic and technology-wise around the modern management of devices and device management or systems management in general.
Great. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how today's session is going to run as well, I'll just give you a quick purpose in a moment in terms of what we're really looking to do. We're then going to really kind of cover off a bit of more of the thought process around how adapting your approach versus what might have been kind of traditional mechanisms or thoughts that would be applied both in previous migrations, but also as we move really to a fairly kind of increasingly tight deadline in terms of when activities need to be completed, how we start to think about that in terms of when we're approaching deployments at scale or at speed. We'll then cover off some technical guidance, so elements that ideally we find beneficial to be aware of, or ask you kind of questions to how you might have done today. And then really the purpose of those kind of pieces is to help open up to a bit of an open Q&A. So we have had a number of questions kind of come in as well, and obviously anyone on the call as well is additionally welcome to ask. Essentially just drop your questions into the questions box and we'll be keeping an eye on those. You know, we may choose to answer some as we go through the session if that makes sense, or certainly what we'll be looking to do is kind of cover off those questions within the Q&A. So just to give you a bit of a quick kind of session intro, as I say, this is very much intended to be kind of a knowledge sharing, kind of really help and support with kind of giving guidance and advice out to people. So there's no massive intention to try and sell you anything particularly within this. There is obviously a few things that we do talk about to that, but really the purpose is to try and kind of share knowledge and information. Given that we're talking around, you know, Windows 7 to 10, that isn't really a new topic of conversation for many, right? So we are trying to look at taking this from an idea where we've seen a number of trusts that still have large parts of the organizations that are trying to work through. So we are taking this from a view of saying that you are still potentially early in the aspects of really kind of executing against your projects. Of course, those on the call that are further ahead, you've already kind of ticked some of the boxes, so you can just kind of take the appropriate elements that really kind of support into it. In this, it's fairly informal, meant to be informative, and hopefully aim to kind of really kind of provide information to you. But as said, this is aimed to really be a Q&A. So if we can make it much more effective for you through your questions, we do welcome your questions, and obviously they'll really be the point of what we're trying to do to help support the NHS and others in terms of gaining access to info they can use. So without further ado, we'll kind of dive into a little bit around adapting your approach. So some of the things to think about, and this again is really meant to be kind of giving some of that ideas and thought processes that can really try to help shape the format and the principles by which you really kind of look to take to accelerate. Now, there's a number of bits and pieces that we would kind of think of as certainly some elements that kind of come front to mind. There's obviously a lot of moving components in a 7 to a 10 migration, but one that kind of really comes to mind initially would be think about this in terms of the target scale of deployment confidence. So what we mean by that is traditionally in terms of migrations, it's normally been aspects where they've been projected over a long period of time, and also kind of more traditional mechanisms have followed, say, a more manually hands-on aspect where you might have used either a larger number of contractors to support walking around with deployments and updates and other bits and pieces like that. In both modern times, in terms of unfortunately where we find ourselves in kind of current COVID situations and otherwise, as well as obviously just fundamentally the timelines that we have, the real approach that we're thinking about with this now to help drive that over the line is the approach of driving it at scale. That means that really what we're looking to do is make sure that where we go through this process, we've marked off and completed actions and technical readiness capabilities. That means that actually you start to hit this with large numbers of devices later in the project scope. So we're not trying to get how quickly can we start rolling Windows 10 out in terms of just being able to get it out there, which might sound counterintuitive a little bit when we talk about approaching it at speed, because actually what we're really looking to do is say we have hit and covered off all the environmental and considerational points, which mean when we start to deploy, we can start deploy en masse and really covering off your estate in actually a period of a few short weeks to month and a half, 2 months kind of period of time when you really start to actually trigger the deployment. So there's a lot of pieces that kind of move into that, but think differently in terms of comparative to where we might have done early process pieces and other bits that might have been at a much more manual intervention types of considerations in terms of previous sites. One thing that we'd certainly kind of see that, it can be common that, finding ourselves in positions at the moment as well, both due to normally speaking like large volumes of work that might have slowed down initial projects or other aspects that have typically led to obviously being in a position where there's still volume of work to do around migrating from 7 to 10. It can be quite common that effectively minds are drawn to really zero in on kind of technical blockers that are seen throughout the process. I suppose one of the things that we'd really say is there's a numerous moving parts within a process around migration too, both communications, end user expectations, different moving elements within the technical aspect as well. One thing that we'd certainly say is always try and look at keeping a step up in respect of the actual elements that you're working to, so that your focus on removing a single technical blocker doesn't actually detriment your progress in terms of completing the overall objective. There's, if there's something is causing an issue, such as either a profile deployment or something affecting the kind of image considerations or otherwise, obviously that has to be worked through, but there's then a lot of tasks that will come following that can be progressed whilst the work to remediate is occurring as well. So do think of this in terms of it doesn't have to be linear step tasks. There's a range of tasks that can be done in parallel prior to the earlier tasks that it might have a dependency on. So we're really thinking around making sure that we don't try and delay ourselves by having too narrow a focus in terms of the actual kind of tick off and completion of technical aspects as you go through it. With respect to obviously the actual motion as well, one of the key things to think too is actually, technical perfection is not necessarily the aim relevant to this as well. Of course, we want to deliver the most, technically capable service, and it has to obviously meet minimum criteria to ensure that you can technically achieve a good rollout. But what we're really kind of thinking here is actually setting good expectations is primary over technical perfection. So an obvious maybe one that kind of comes to mind with respect to that is certain ways around how you handle applications. Depending on where you are in your application journey, the usual thing is we need to perform UAT testing across every application and a load of range of activities in terms of saying rationalizing every technical application and moving through the usual bits and pieces. Those things are certainly preferable, but in a contingency where you're looking towards driving speed, there are different ways of handling it in terms of what must you do now and how does that obviously give confidence to the overarching process. So things to think about in terms of is taking ways of, basically your app kind of process. Do you say that anything that's got less than 10 installs that is actually going to be handled as a request based following the primary migration for users. Do we think about it in terms of saying that actually the UAT testing we're going to primarily cover off during the pilot exercise? So we'll make sure that we've communicated with users, we'll make sure we've done that, but it allows us to progress to a state of application readiness in terms of the actual process of delivering pilot far quicker. And also it's thinking about things where actually we're not necessarily trying to revolutionize the application estate. We're really trying to bring at least a capability parity from what it was in terms of previously, or similarity, depending obviously again on time and considerations that start to affect into that. But again, it's that type of overall mindset where it's the pragmatism that comes into allowing you to actually accelerate a lot of moving parts. And then a lot of those that are actually handled can then be dealt with as post-migration tasks as well, to enhance and improve, or obviously considerations based on time, money, and other bits and pieces that you have available to you as to how far you take it. And again, the thing that you can probably get a bit of a resounding kind of statement throughout is going to be that traditional methods that would have been typically used in a large range of organizations and approaches where, again, large number of contractors to do manual deployments or going around with USB sticks and all those kind of things that we've done in the past is just not going to work for us in terms of as we are now. So it is thinking to this is system driven over traditional methods. Manual installation of apps is going to be problematic for you. So it is thinking about how you get the right tool in place with your core applications in a ready state so that you again can do this at scale. You're not limited by, say, traditional human factors that would kind of have a natural kind of funnel or effectively constraint in terms of the actual number of devices and number of bits and pieces that you're able to work through. When we think in terms of this, then some of the key kind of task checklist, again, this isn't necessarily exhaustive, but the kind of key elements that you need to think that you've got in play. Number one, that kind of comes really with an approach of this. And again, going back to the idea that essentially we probably find ourselves in a position where you've got an awful lot of tasks going on. That's true in every organization, but especially true in NHS with the kind of reactive and supportive needs going on in terms of making sure businesses can continue to operate. But with the kind of time sensitivity of this, and typically we're speaking that you'll always have more volume of work than you have resource to complete, it's around ensuring that you do get that kind of executive oversight into this to both allow for the prioritization of resource dedicated to it for the period that it needs, as well as then the input and decision acceleration. What can be very common within these kind of programs is there are lots of decisions where there are of course numerous options that you can take, some that will slow you down, some that will speed you up, and some that might be considered, you know, a business risk or a business kind of consideration to take. Having that kind of executive input on at key points within the process and ensuring certain level of oversight just means that rather than losing a week here or a week there or even longer due to kind of decisions kind of somewhat going around the mill, it can just obviously kind of release some of those decision processes much quicker and allow you to be able to proceed much faster as well. And again, with the kind of crucial time frame to this, it is very important to be able to make sure that that is available and is kind of seen as a key task within it. The kind of element that you want to obviously make sure as well is that you do have some core user communications. Given the aspects of speed that will be going through, you know, there's lots of ranges around how people handle people and adoption and change management sides. And, you know, but the element here is to really think about what do we need as a core. You know, for us, when we start to think about an accelerated deployment motion, normally we start thinking about kind of 4 primary communication points: the initial awareness, the informational point in terms of giving the detail of what's going to be actually happening for that user / device associated, the reminder just before the event, and then a post follow-up kind of action. Covering off those 4 key points will at least give you a good view of how you're actually communicating to users and give your users good awareness without necessarily needing to over-engineer how your user communications may be taking place. A key thought process as well is now that we're probably limited to not necessarily having the same ability to be able to do floor walking, how we handle that kind of user enablement to be able to support awareness and kind of informational guidance to those users, and how that kind of is presented in a way where it can just be kind of, again, simplified and say easy to consume on a remote or access basis as well for users as we move through the actual migration steps. We do need to consider, again, as a primary, the tooling We have talked around that just briefly in terms of the fact that essentially the manual kind of migration approaches that would have been more traditional are really kind of limited in this aspect. And also we find ourselves in a position where the location of the devices are not so assured. It'd be quite common to say, well, actually everything's going to be on our network. It's not able to necessarily say that now. You might have a lot of users working from home, and the logistical challenges of trying to get all those users in during the process when you migrate can be very challenging in terms of being able to make that real. So actually being able to have an enterprise tooling that can handle devices that are off your network and still be able to perform the upgrades with the associated security and task sequence type elements that will allow you to build the Windows 10 to the configuration the business needs to meet NHS Digital's compliance requirements and other aspects that you'll have is pretty crucial to be able to kind of give you that ability to succeed in this motion as well. Simplified application, I've mentioned it and don't want to necessarily keep laboring the point to it, but it's a pretty crucial one to help you speed up. Apps are typically the area where most people get slowed down. So really kind of understanding that app and focusing predominantly on your core apps and making sure that those have been tested, packaged, and quality assured. And that then leads you to a position where actually you can get into that pilot early on in the process as possible. You can then ensure you can manage and handle your additional application considerations as we progress and as more of a response team to the actual aspects as you might identify them. But I would certainly say look towards trying to simplify your application estate in terms of how you approach the management of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it won't have tasks that you'll then continue to proceed with post-migration, during migration, but it will mean that you can get to the point of achieving rollout to larger degrees of your estate in a much quicker time than you would traditionally done if you were following an expanded methodology, as it were. With the fact that we're starting to push this to say, actually we're hitting volume at scale, so that really requires, and again to the point relevant to timings, that you've got your end-to-end process nailed. If you were doing kind of 20, 30 devices and you start to hit into problems, then you can obviously start to roll back and manage and mitigate those. When you're going to start hitting 200, 500, 1,000 devices within the space of a week, then you want to be able to make sure that you've got complete confidence that your end-to-end process is going to function as expected. So really the validation of that is crucial, and then that gives you that trigger point that you can start to hit your devices at a larger number and really be then able to cover your organization within a reduced time frame in terms of the overall migration steps. And finally, just the actual management of this. In terms of the kind of user device schedule, that's going to be pretty crucial. Making sure you've early planned in and kind of thought about as well the kind of considerations, the different kind of variables that you might have that will affect when users can move, and really put that into a kind of a core set of deployment ways. Typically speaking, depending on size, you of course can expand them, but we would kind of think of this in terms of having a pilot and 4 primary deployment waves to really kind of give you that ability to push this through in a rapid response time, but with the right level of planning and time in to give you that continual build in confidence as you continue to kind of increase the volume that you're pushing through. Now, when you start to think about these, there are ways that you can help expand and speed them up. Think about considering e-learning resources. These can be acquired on a 6-monthly basis to kind of give you a period of time where resources are available to users on demand, as well as there are kind of project command and control toolings that could really help you in terms of how you organize your communications out to users. You think about the way that you can maybe adopt and just kind of buy in elements that are, say, key for you to be able to deliver. So service options around the actual enterprise tooling, take it as a cloud subscription or otherwise that are available from us in this aspect, but also, in terms of how you might be able to deliver that, and that kind of NHS standard build options as well, rather than trying to recreate from new for yourselves. There's ways of more consuming standardized that have been proved with other NHS organizations in the market. And again, really that same kind of tooling side that kind of can support you with user comms. There's options there that you can really help to speed this up. Mention these not necessarily because you have to go and buy loads of bits and pieces, but realistically to help you speed processes through. There are definitely some things you'll want to consider from an investment or from an options perspective to help you. Now, when we come to then actually what the primary methods are, there's always kind of numerous methods that you can use to apply down to deployment of devices. Typically, though, for an average enterprise and approaches, we're kind of tending to see within most NHSs now that you're going to have what we would refer to as an OS initiated, and I'll explain that in a second, but essentially normally about 60% plus of your estate would represent as a target for an OS initiated model, whereas probably 40% or less of your estate, depending on your hardware profile and refresh, will require a device replacement. That kind of 40% trigger can be really kind of thought about in two also primary ways. There's elements that must be replaced, so simply devices that will not support moving into a Windows 10 due to either resource capacity, hardware limitations, or otherwise. Such as you do want to have at least a minimum TPM to support encryption, but when you start going to more advanced or BIOS modes and other things, those can be what we would consider more needs rather than musts. And so needs would be considerations where you can get the device estate up to 10, but you'll want to replace them within the kind of next year in terms of them bringing them up to a consistency of actually how security and otherwise is supporting. Main points there, again, commercials that you have to be able to buy new hardware, as well as availability of new hardware within the timeframes and other pieces that you're looking at. Within respect of OS initiated, this is where what we're looking to do is be able to upgrade a device, in some respects, wherever it is, as long as we've got internet connectivity to it. We're not actually leveraging, in this context, the Microsoft in-place upgrade model, for those that are familiar with it, but rather a wipe and load kind of task sequence that will be initiated from Config Manager, similar to the in-place, but rather whereas the in-place requires you to have gone through a large amount of validation and a complete holistic testing and process across all the applications and everything in your estate, the wipe and load follows a similar methodology, but allows you to kind of take a quicker resolution approach, if you will. So it means that essentially you will be able to apply that upgrade. It isn't necessarily doing a bare metal, so it is a wipe and load, but it allows you to really kind of drive a remote deployment to a wide variety of your devices in a confident way as well in terms of that. So just to give you a quick idea of the kind of the project schedule, I'm not necessarily going to give you a laborious overview of this because conscious that we really want to just give you kind of food for thought as we kind of go through information. But it's really kind of just trying to highlight, some kind of key areas and some kind of tasks and activity pieces. One of the pieces we're going to look to do as well is make available to everyone, and it should be available from Monday, kind of a template project plan that you can adopt and use. Technically, the original master had over 800 tasks. It's going to be a lot shorter than that, but it's just to really kind of help give you some guidance around using it potentially, or kind of framing up some of the actual project plans and activities that you have already. Some of the key things that you'll notice within this is really getting that data analysis in early, and the actual kind of making sure you are also moving forwards with the project governance task early in the process as well. Those should not wait until you start to hit pilot, as that can happen quite often, that people leave them until they need to do them. Try and get them done early in the process so you don't find yourself on the back foot. You can then look to me making sure that you're doing a couple of activities in parallel, and this is again coming back to some of that executive support for resource. When you're obviously applying parallel, it's either going to be needing additional resource internally or supporting resource from partners and otherwise to assist you in terms of getting those elements ready. You'll see that crucial aspects there, such as the migration tests, is really then the precursor or the trigger point to when you start to hit into your pilots, as well as then actually you'll note from the timings within respect of this that your actual primary deployment waves happen quite late within the cycle. That is intentional, that is how it's meant to work, but what it's giving you is it's giving you all that kind of validation, testing, readiness, and making sure that when you actually hit that production, you can hit it at scale. And so you're not kind of finding yourself mired in issues and trying to troubleshoot individual bits and pieces on a less structured, shall we say, approach when you start to come to the project, if you're just trying to start deploy early without that kind of more structured testing and covering off the key elements that make up the actual kind of Windows 10 migration process. So hopefully that just give you a little bit of food for thought on some of the actual structure and some of the approach and mindset. Just going to ask then and hand over to Steve, who's going to give you a bit of guidance relevant to some of the technical components that also kind of factor in and plan into this, given some of the elements we've just kind of covered off. So Steve, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. So as you've just heard Phil going through and discussing that, obviously there's a big piece of project work around this. There's lots of moving parts. One of them moving parts is a deployment tool set. You need something to be able to actually look at how you technically get Windows 10 out to your devices. Now, there's lots of different tool sets on the market. You might already have investments in things like Landesk and Dell Case and so on. We're obviously a Microsoft specialist, and we prefer to work with the tool that was actually built by the people that actually make the operating system, because it just makes sense to have that conjoined tool set that both is really capable of doing the deployment side as well as doing the ongoing lifecycle management, and that is Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Referred to previously as Configuration Manager or SCCM. This is the tool set that we look at how we can structure out not only the technical method of deploying the operating system, so using something that we call task sequences to logically define the process of the deployment, but also using it as that wider management tool set to help you do the things like the discovery of your current devices, what's out there, because it's pretty key to say that data is king. A lot of the things that you do within a Windows 10 migration project rely on intelligent decisions based on data. It's not guesswork, it's understanding what you have, what is the estate looking like, what are the things that are going to trip you up, what do you have to do to prepare. So being able to gather inventory information across both the hardware, the applications, the user side, locations is key and critical, and to be able to feed that into some of the planning tools that you'll use, your Excel or actual dedicated planning tool sets, makes this migration process a lot easier. Now, again, other tool sets will gather that type of information. It could be done manually, but for speed and simplicity at this point in time in the Windows 10 or the Windows 7 lifecycle rundown, having an industry standard database that is well known and has lots of connections into other tool systems just makes perfect sense. As I say, it's not just about having something that can simply put an image down to a machine, but having that wider capabilities and aspects of the deployment toolset that again helps unlock some of the challenges that we see around migration things. And that's usually around the configuration side of it, having the options to be able to intelligently decide, well, actually, based on this area that we're targeting, that has a high proportion of, say, laptops, etc., that we know full well the staff work on rotas, they go off at 4 in the afternoon, yet we're targeting deployment at 8, being able to say, well, actually, one of our biggest challenges is them laptops are going to go to sleep, for example. How do we make sure that they don't go to sleep? How can we use the tool set to set them configuration policies to say, have a high performance profile to optimize the speed of the deployment, to keep them on so they don't go to sleep halfway through it, and use things like wake up timers, etc., to ensure the devices are up and available at the schedule that we define for the deployment. Could go to the next one, please, Phil. Now, talk about the scheduling, but also really key and critical for any sort of activity when it comes to a big, large migration project is around that end user experience. At the end of the day, things like this are seen as the face of IT. They don't really care around how much technical wizardry went into the back end and how complex it was. If it interrupts them too much, if it's not when they expect it, if it's not when they need it, then obviously that impacts on the reputation of IT at the best of times. So concentrating on that user experience has been one of the big main key parts of the technical delivery side, looking at how we can minimize the customer interruption and the impact, how we can use different deployment methodologies to either schedule it or make sure that it's a very well-defined push deployment at a specific time that's well communicated, or make it as an available option that users can go and pull down as either a complementary method to the others, so that you can say, right, it will be available from this time onwards, but it will happen at this date. And if it's most appropriate for you and you have some spare time, you can go and pull it down on demand when you request. Helps again both on that interaction with the customer, helps with the expectations, and also make sure that you are meeting the goals that you define through the communications of when things are going to happen. But conversely as well, that is also needs to be thought about around if you say that it will happen either at this time, or you say right, we're communicating that this upgrade process will take 1 hour, and yet when the user then goes and initiates it, or when it hits that scheduled time, you have to wait for another hour and a half, 2 hours for content to download, you're not going to be, again, meeting them expectations. So looking at the different mechanisms that you can use with things like Config Manager to stage content in advance, either on the device ready, especially important if you're doing the whole wipe and reload scenario, as I'll talk about in a minute, especially important if you're doing it remotely outside of your network, having that content on the device ready to go so that it will immediately have it without having to wait longer is very important. In other scenarios where you might have better connected networks, or you've got staff that are still in and on premises, then just making sure that there are data caches around localized to the devices, again, is still about staging that content ready, but not necessarily on the device, just to, again, optimize the time it takes to download across a WAN link, a LAN link, rather than a WAN link. Again, user experience-wise, the main driver is to make sure that when the upgrade is complete, it's all right as saying, yes, fine, we technically managed to get the image down to the machine in 15 minutes. It was brilliant. We got Windows 10 on there. But when the user logged on, they wasn't able to be productive, does not make it a ready to go scenario. So again, making sure that the user has that good experience when they log on, and they have at least a minimum set of core applications that enables them to be at least productive across their core tasks. For example, in NHS, making sure that the identity agents are on there for smart card access, so you can at least get to browser-based applications. Wider, making sure that the Office suite is there, for example. Everyone lives in emails or things like Teams, so they can at least collaborate and be productive in that manner. Or if there are very core line of business applications that everyone uses, they should be delivered along with the image to make sure that it's ready to go. Other applications, there's lots of different ways that we can look at doing dynamic application deployments for per departments and stuff. But again, with the speed that needs to happen on some of these, so there does need to be some good decisions made around how you approach the wider application set and when is the most appropriate time for that to come down to the machines, or how to deliver it, whether there is much more of a drive towards self-service. So again, users can still go see it, and get on with it, but not necessarily slowing down the deployment aspect of getting to Windows 10 in the first place. If you don't mind the next one, please, Phil. Now, I briefly mentioned around that whole idea of staging content, which does come into a very important scenario in the situations that we are in currently, and also generally where you do have a very mobile workforce. So if you have staff that are out, either constantly on the road or home-based working, then this is not a restriction anymore to getting to Windows 10. Previously, it was very much driven around that LAN aspect, making sure the devices are connected to nice high-speed networks, close to distribution points to be able to pull it down and to be able to get that content to the machine across that wire, in effect. Now, especially with the current situation, we also can't rely on users connecting via VPN to do this. And by connecting via VPN, that also puts a strain on your external internet pipes on delivering all the content. It's doable. It's been doable for quite some time. However, we have more options now, especially with Configuration Manager, in terms of things like the Cloud Management Gateway. Now, this gives us much more of an internet-based presence to make sure that even if devices aren't connecting to VPNs, staff will generally connect a device to the home Wi-Fi, etc., just to get access to various news sources, get access to internal intranet sites and so on, just so they can do their basic tasks. But that does mean that we still gain management control when using a CMG. It also means that we can use that same approach of making sure that we dribble down the content to the device. We're not putting the strains on our organizational internet pipes because we're pulling it directly from Azure down over the user's home broadbands. It doesn't matter if them broadbands are slow. We can, like I say, dribble that content. Doesn't have to happen within a set period and then it restarts. We can take a couple of days to bring that content down to the device. And then once it is on the device, doing the OSInitiated start to build Windows 10, where we don't format and partition drives, but we do basically a wipe and sanitation, but we're retaining data with hard links, means we have that content there ready to reapply with Windows 10, with the apps. We can then still talk to the main config manager infrastructure via the cloud management gateway, give the status updates, give extra content that we might need during the process. And then we can make sure that we build that device remotely, make sure that VPNs, connections, software and stuff's on there so the users can come back in, or look at other alternatives such as Azure AD join and so on. So it's really important to consider that where the device is will impact the methodology for deployment, but more so you can use the same sort of methodology of pre-caching in the different scenarios to now unblock them scenarios before that would have been considered hard blockers or major challenges and having to think about scheduling with staff rotations coming in. They can be addressed and looked at to increase the amount of at-scale remote deployments that you currently do.
Just one thing piece to add as well, Steve, not to cut across you, but we mentioned obviously configuration manager a couple of times as well. I know traditionally as well, it's been a blocker for a number of NHS organizations and other customers as well, relevant to owning their ownership of it. For those NHS orgs with us on the call as well today, under the new M365 contract, depending on what your organization subscribes to, if they subscribe to the EM&S package, then you are getting configuration manager within that. So it can also help you if you've got concerns there around some of the licensing restrictions that you might have been previously challenged by as well, just as a point of note more than anything else.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that have come in on the channel around just basically config manager and time to deployment. We can pick them up later in the Q&A, or did you want to tackle some of them now? We'll pick them up in the Q&A in a minute.
Yeah, we're close to the Q&A, so we'll just jump onto that.
That is a good segue, and I meant to say that as well, just to reiterate what Phil mentioned right at the beginning. If you do have questions, please add them into the question chat channel. Some have already come in at the bottom, but obviously this is your chance to grill us, not just on the content now, but anything related to this. So there is the questions and answers chat functionality within GoToWebinar, so please do use it and add in any thoughts that you have around this or questions that you may want answering that are semi-related. If you want to go to the next slide for me, Phil. So technically, yes, we've got tool sets. Yes, we can do lovely magic wizardry with scripts and all sorts in the task sequence and logical ordering. We can do deployment methodologies of how we're actually going to target devices and get them down, get content down to it and initiate it and so on. But as Phil was talking in that first segment around that actual project management and control and starting to look at how we identify where we're going to target, who we're going to target, what the devices look like. I mentioned earlier around, yes, we have data and stuff within things like the config manager database, but that is just one source of information. So having something like a proper project command and control tooling set, something like Migration Studio, allows us to start consuming multiple data sources and bringing in a live view from technical systems. So bring in some of the information from config, bring it in from the HR system, bring it in from Active Directory, and actually then start to manipulate that data to help form your plans. Use the things in the inventory to look at what applications are out there in the estate. What does that rationalized view look like when we get rid of some of all the noise around different versions? But more specifically, if we target certain specific applications for readiness first, what does that look like in terms of unblocking us for readiness of which devices? So rather than specifically starting to look at saying, well, actually, no, we just want to go and target number 2 Timbuktu because we know there's 50 devices in there. Actually, if we go and target applications A, B, and C, that unblocks 2,000 devices that we can then go and deploy to. So using it in an intelligent fashion to look at what the structure of our readiness looks like within a tool set to be able to normalize the data sets, relate it, because it's a relational database, between device, apps and users and departments will help you form your deployment plans based on readiness, which will then allow you to start to schedule it and communicate out from the platform to drive out saying, right, these applications are ready, they fall into this bucket. We can automatically push communications from the system then that target them specific users to say, this is the schedule that we would like to run you on. You can do lots of lovely, wonderful things then around decisions, around changing schedules, etc. if needs be. But you can then do continuous communication based on your plan to say, this is going to happen in T-3 weeks, this is going to happen in T-2, this is going to happen tomorrow. And you can use the tool set to intelligently drive your decisions on what's ready to go and when, linked in with all the things that we talked around in terms of communication plans. Anything to add on that, Phil?
No, I think that's a pretty good coverage. It's really, I think the point with this is something that can just be taken on again on about a 6-month subscription. So it's not necessarily something you have to long-term commit to, but the point being is traditionally trying to manage Excel spreadsheets and lists and everything else is quite a task. So anything that can really help you speed up your process, but also give you a lot more confidence that your information you're working from is live, is a massive benefit when you're going through the actual process. So we certainly found that to be very useful, and it's something that you can subscribe to, you know, individually or otherwise, or obviously we can help you. But yeah, it really does help kind of give that information live, real kind of feedback, rather than necessarily kind of manual snapshots, which can be long to prepare and quickly out of date, I suppose is the points with those.
Definitely, otherwise you need to make sure you got a very beefy machine with 64-bit Excel just to cope with the amount of data that you put into Excel on these type of things, let alone keeping it up to date.
Aye.
Yeah. Cool. So some of the key risks to be managed and mitigated throughout these projects. Obviously, when we start to go and put things in there, start to plan where, then the first starting points that we've said is obviously you do need to have, I said it before, data is king, making sure that inventory is available, that you are making decisions based on hard, raw information that you can filter down and make them decisions and then pivots around. Any tool set's applicable, like we say, you have options, whether you want to do a lot of the manual lifting, whether you want to put into systems that will do it for you. You need to make this a data-driven decision process. Again, highlighted it very briefly, making sure that it is not just a case of technically, yep, fine, we've got something that will push it, off we go, but looking at how we start to build up a configuration set. It's not, especially with the speed that we need to get to, about completely revolutionizing everything for Windows 10 and starting with all brand new untested policies. Start simple, start with the basics that will allow you to get the OS in and working with users, and then iterate on it. Don't go to brand new major hard lockdown security provisions if you are not already doing them. Get to Windows 10 and then look to improve things like your security postures. But again, do the little tweaks that improve your process around things like your power settings, making sure devices don't shut down or they do wake up. Scheduling, absolutely important. Said about both the user experience side, making sure that you know from that data set where you're going to target, when you're going to target, and you communicate that out with the users. And that doesn't just be restricted to doing that remote deployment side. That comes across when you are doing them physical device replacements as well, making sure that they're aware when they need to either drop device back in, when they're going to be shipped devices and so on, and make sure that you plan it really well, because that will address your resource requirements as well, because you'll know when you'll need that extra batches of people to be able to support the rollouts or the replacements that you're doing. And having them stock to hand, because while you may do a large percentage of these remotely, things will always go wrong. So plan for the worst. Make sure that if you say, fine, we're going to do large sets of deployments, but when we get 1, 2 failures, we are there ready with pre-built machines to be able to immediately swap if they're on site. They can drop in, collect one, or you ship it out, however you need to do, but make sure that there is a fallback methodology in your plans when considering remote rollouts. And that leads on to the logistics side, obviously, that if you do need to get these devices out, then how quickly can you respond to that? It's no good going, well, fine, we've got a stock, but actually it takes 3 days to organize a courier, they'll come pick it up, and that uses down. Decide what you're going to do from the outset. Is it going to be internal resources that you have driving around the local area, dropping them off? Do you have a courier coming through and say, right, actually, we're going to have a courier scheduled every Wednesday and deployment is going to happen on the Tuesday night, for example? Plan that out right from the outset of how you can get things like devices out, or look at the logistics of how you can use technologies like Microsoft's Windows Virtual Desktop to on-demand scale and spin up things like a virtual desktop in the cloud, so that if the user's work or corporate device does break during the upgrade, they can fall back to things like bring your own device scenarios and use personal devices to connect very securely to a cloud-driven WVD instance to still get on with being productive, while you then logistically sort out swapping out the machine and so on, or just running repairs on it. A lot of this is predicated, and Phil opened with this at the beginning of the slides, around having the decisions and the resources available to support this. It's no good having the best plan in the world, but when it comes to execution time, everyone's busy doing business as usual activities, or they're assigned to other projects. So making sure that even if you're saying that I'm going to deploy 200 a night, so I don't need much staff, you need to make sure you know what that profile of support for the end users, that enablement for the next day, looks like, so that either resources on the service desk are there, available, prepped, or you have dedicated projects, and you have dedicated project resources to be able to deliver the remote support after, or the remediation of failed ones, or scheduling for the prepping of it. You need to make sure that it's factored in right from the outset, so you know what you need to work with.
Great. I think that leads us nicely then into the kind of open Q&A side of the session as well. So as Steve said, we've had a number of questions come in. Please feel free to drop any additional ones that you do have into the box, but we'll kick off with a couple of questions and hopefully help answer some of your kind of queries there. So one piece that's come in, Steve, or the first one here, is what kinds of impacts do you tend to see on the network when deploying at scale? And I suppose the question then would be also, how do you maybe manage those?
Yeah, well, I think this probably comes from when I was just talking around about distributing content and stuff everywhere. And absolutely, this is one of the things why I say it is good to make sure that you pre-stage as much of the content as possible. Normal operation-wise, if you were just building the ad hoc machine and so on, you can generally get a fairly decent network link, do the whole pixie boot and pull down anywhere between 4 and 25 to 30 gig of data for building a machine. I kid you not, I've seen some customers with 60 gig images. It all depends on what your requirements are. Now, if you're going to try and do that en masse on scale across a wide area network, let alone a LAN, then you are going to swamp it. And this is why we specifically recommend, as part of your planning and as part of your scheduling in, then weeks before you start to distribute content, because that gives you the ability to throttle the traffic. You stage it over time, and this goes back to that same concept of thinking and almost treating everything as if it was remotely internet connected, whether regardless of whether it's on premises or not. You dribble the content to reduce that network impact. If you are dribbling that content, you can practically ignore it on the network because it becomes a very low background task, unless you deliberately turn the dial up to go faster, but then that's for your awareness to kind of bounce it in your network. The main thing to do is, main point to get across here, sorry, is that it can be done with little to no impact on the network if planned correctly.
Okay. Next question was, we don't currently have config manager. What alternatives or what guidance would you have?
Okay, so this nicely links back to when we was just talking around that new allocation for like the N365 central deal and so on, or just generally when I mentioned if you've got third-party systems that might not be able to do some of the stuff that I talked about. Yes, absolutely recommend that you should have Config Manager in for this type of thing. So if you don't currently have it, well, you've got a couple of different challenges. It's either the time and the decisions of whether you do want to build and stand it up on premises, etc. Or we do have options from ourselves where we basically have cloud-hosted multi-tenancy versions or dedicated versions where you can have access to it within a matter of days, because we can just spin up an instance within our environment that we already have hosted ready there for scale.
Yeah, I think I'd probably just add to that as well is there's definitely a piece where a tooling is needed, given some of the options that are coming through national contracts, or just generally speaking, depending on where customers are investing in their licensing. Then Config Manager is certainly something that we would suggest is a recommendation of choice, especially given its ability to use via the cloud management gateways, which are an Azure extension, so a pretty lightweight cost, but allows you to basically manage the devices over the internet, to then address those kind of home worker scenarios for still being able to update and upgrade. If it is something where you are challenged with that to be able to have time or capacity to bring that in internally, then as Steve mentioned there is an online version that we can provide, and you don't necessarily have to do a long-term commitment to that if you feel it's just something that you need for the period of getting you across the line. Like we're happy to be pretty flexible, even giving short-term aspects for migrations and things, but certainly something that you can reach out. We can provide some more detail. I think the challenge that you do have is that the alternatives are reasonably limited, to be straightly frank as well, because the traditional elements like WDS or the MDT sides, they just aren't really fit for purpose for this type of scenario. So it does give you a fairly rock and a hard place type choice, really, unfortunately, relevant to that.
They're fine for bare metal building, but not for remote migration projects.
Yeah. So if you're doing a lot of hardware replacements, those can absolutely still be a good option, and you can still use those. It still has a reasonable amount of light touch expected per device, but it can still absolutely be a viable route. But yeah, for remote deployments and otherwise, that expansion to an enterprise tool is pretty crucial. I know you mentioned it, but that downtime for users' devices, like what's the typical average that you, just to reinforce that in terms that you're seeing relevant when you're doing these kind of upgrades?
Can I use the good old consultant answer of it depends? Yes, it does depend. On average, though, so it's more thing around the number of applications and stuff that you build into it. So with just a basic core set of that we typically see, especially for most organizations, Office and a few line of business applications and maybe some security products and so on, we do have good success at seeing as long as the content's staged, then a typical build time can be anywhere from about 33 minutes through to about 45 to 48.
And then you'd have the apps on top of that, though, just to make sure
that's with core. Yeah, that's with core apps. So
okay.
I'm ready to go at that point, and then we see more time added if you want to then throw larger line of business apps either after it for departmental usage and so on. So I know one customer that we've just been imaging a lot for, they were running at that 33 mark, and they had Office plus 12 to 13 other core applications within the image set.
Great. So I suppose
just to clarify, that was a very highly optimized, a lot of work went in to get that. So as the worst case scenario, what we usually say for setting user expectations is it should be sub 1 hour.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, because you absolutely can achieve, like we've been able to achieve really very quick build times, as Steve mentioned there, for NHS and other organisations. But it is considering that as an optimized build. But yeah, traditionally, I think the normal piece is to consider about an hour. Sub is the aim that you should be going for, and really shouldn't be anything beyond an hour and a half type of piece in terms of that when you're building this through. Next question that we had was around prerequisites. So, what would be kind of the prerequisites for assessing devices that will support that kind of in-place or OS-initiated deployment mechanism?
Yes, this comes back to that whole need and must hardware replacement more than anything. So the beauty of doing a wipe and reload deployment rather than the traditional Microsoft in place, I'm going to keep as much of Windows 7 as possible, is you remove a lot of the software dependencies. That's the problem with the Microsoft in place one, that yes, it is a viable option. However, with the speed of stuff, you spend a lot of time trying to work out where all your compatibility blockers and stuff and preparing new drivers, new applications that all have to be distributed beforehand. So to avoid that and to reduce the amount of software prerequisites or eliminate software prerequisites, this is why we recommend the wipe and reload scenario, because then you are just looking at hardware prerequisites. There will be some hardware prerequisites that dictate the need to replace devices. So things like, does it have a TPM chip? Doesn't have a TPM chip, you're not doing disk encryption and so on. Does it have the minimum requirement of 4 gig of RAM for Windows 10? No. Then you're either looking at doing memory swap outs, which with this time, the extra effort that goes into that and the cost of buying it probably outweighs the cost of buying a new device, to be honest. I would also highlight that 4 gig, while that is the minimum, will give you a pretty poor end user experience on Windows 10. The same with the decisions you need to make around, do you keep spinning Rust disks or do you actually move to SSDs? Definitely, again, recommend using SSDs as the default. Again, user experience with hard drives is terrible, and it is all about the user experience. So things like that will dictate your need to replace devices. Lack of TPM chips, lack of BIOSes that can support UEFI, for example. Must have UEFI capable devices. So make the decisions based around that. And then some of your musts come down to things like, do the actual OEM suppliers even support the hardware on the target version of Windows 10? It is no longer just a conversation of, does it support Windows 10, like we used to do with does it support Vista and Windows 7 and XP and so on. It's which flavor of Windows 10 does it support. Dell have a nice list published, HP have a nice list published. We need to make decisions of actually that Optiplex 790, it only officially supports and has been tested by Dell up to Windows 10 1803, for example. You're not going to deploy 1803 because it's not supported with patches and stuff anymore. So do we take the risk of deploying 1909 that while it might technically work, we have no recourse or support or updated drivers or even Dell fixes for things if something goes wrong or the security flaw on it. So there is then that decision of should replace or need to replace.
Cool, sounds good. So there's one around communications, what would be the key elements to ensure are communicated to users to help ensure success? So I suppose I could cover a bit of that as well. It's a great question, and it is somewhat subjective to be totally honest. But the key aspects that really I would say from our experience in terms of communicating out to users is expectations is got to be number one. So what are the users going to be expecting during the process of this? So things around timings, things around their involvement. So quite often it can be that there's some dependencies on them making sure that they have the devices on, that they've communicated any holidays, things like that back to the group as well. But also I'd say, making sure that there is that kind of method around just gentle reminders as well is going to be important. Assuming that a user's either read the first or read the second is always a bit risky. So trying to programmatically address it just to try and eliminate some of the potential kind of just general communication gaps that happen in a large program such as this, as well as a pretty important one is in terms of where they can actually go for support. Depending on what you'll have available to support them, is going to be making sure that then you are able to kind of communicate that actually their first port of call is not necessarily the support desk. It should be the training hub that you might have made available with some core information and some core guidance and things like that. It could be that you've set some champions relevant to departments and other bits, so you kind of direct them that way. But expectations would be crucial. kind of making sure that their obligations are understood, and then where they can go to actually get assistance and support to try and reduce the weight on your service desk for first line tickets. I would say, I'm sure you'd be amazed, but I'm sure you won't as well. We've had everything from, I don't know how to turn off Windows 10, to obviously complex apps and other bits and pieces that aren't working, and everything in between in terms of tickets that can then come in from users when you're starting to go through these migration processes. So it's just trying to cover off that 80% of baseline generic elements that will tend to come through. Simple kind of how do I do this? How do I do that? What's different? Is really probably the most crucial bits to make sure you've got in your communications. Whether there's anything you'd add to that, Steve?
No, yeah, that's obviously spot on as usual. But I am going to steal this next question to ask you, because while I'll have a technical answer to it, it's probably more keen to understand what some of that business and planning aspect of it is. So someone's asked, how critical is packaging apps for deployment? It's kind of, yeah, fine. A lot of this because it's technically delivered, and as mentioned, core apps and stuff. Yes, from a technical standpoint, apps should be packaged, and especially the core apps. But what about that wider decision? What does it impact on?
Well, it's a good question as well. I suppose there's quite a few facets to the answer to it, not to try and circumvent the answer, but essentially it's very common that people have a massive trail or tail, as it be typically referred to, of applications where users have either managed, because they haven't necessarily had the same stringent application controls, to drop on a couple of different apps. The level of overhead and complexity it introduces to try and manage into the tail. So what I mean by that is kind of things that have been deployed less than 10 times is significant from a technical aspect. So one of the best pieces I would say is that packaging apps for absolutely core purposes and what hits your enterprise on the volume is a must. But actually working to say that you need to package every app is just simply not true. You will tend to find that actually when you go, we're not doing it for anything of less than 10, the vast majority of people won't even actually re-request the application because they may have actually had it for other periods of time. Or if you're getting that down to that communication of setting expectations, it drastically reduces the volume of your work. We've seen that, kind of successfully implemented in hospitals and otherwise, where they've been able to really just get on quicker with the Windows rollout without having to then spend a laborious amount of time in terms of trying to resolve a lot of those applications. It is true that you do, though, want to be able to respond to requests as they come in. So, setting those parameters around what you feel is a legitimate response or a kind of a way of managing it. But then you can handle by request those applications that sit outside of what you would deem as core or primary applications that you would do. And as I say, that can have a drastic effect. I would say that, again, to really both get into the mindset of doing it more effectively moving forwards, because getting to Windows 10 is unfortunately in some respects also the start of your journey you then have to maintain on Windows 10. So get into this mindset of having more system driven side and trying to remove that ability for people to manually load or manually install apps is pretty crucial. But the idea that you need to go through and try and package everything, like you normally get a list of several hundred, it's not the thing that you need to do. It's more about managing the expectations in, and then really helping to reduce your volume of work considerably in terms of through the process, but have a good way of setting like an SLA response to apps that then get requested in terms of moving through that.
Yeah, not to extend this answer too much more, but that point you just made there about that ongoing process, because it's so key to point out that yes, there's a big migration activity going on at the moment to get to Windows 10. But then you're going to be doing it again and again and again with the lifecycle management of it. So the more effort that you put in on an ongoing basis for packaging applications, getting new versions ready for when you will invariably hit compatibility issues between versions, makes absolute sense. So at an ongoing basis, yes, absolutely effort to put there. But as Phil says, for that initial one, not every single little 2 people had this app in one department needs to be packaged to get a successful deployment out there.
And just being conscious of time, we've got a few more, but I think maybe just one more question, and then unfortunately we're running a little over relevant to time. But One question that I think is actually probably quite poignant to ask, and we haven't really mentioned it throughout the process, and there's probably a reason to that, as we'll explain now. But question around, will desktop analytics help gather the required info to prepare?
Oh, my love-hate relationship with desktop analytics. It could have done. So the thing for me is desktop analytics was that evolution of what Microsoft were doing around the Windows upgrade analytics that was specifically to help people get from 7 to 10 and then onwards. The desktop analytics thing is much more more pivoted now for the ongoing lifecycle management. But in addition, the benefits it gives you in terms of knowing what's out there in the estate and what blockers you may have is it's slightly hampered by what it does bring back off Windows 7 devices. It can pull some information, but it's more designed around the telemetry built into Windows 10. So you get a limited subset of information for the Windows 7 migration side. But in addition, there's a lot of work that needs to go into desktop analytics. So the interfaces and the information you have to go and sort out and filter and mark as either compatible, tested, and so on, means that in this short time period that we have left to get to Windows 10, you'll probably find that you would spend too much time utilizing desktop analytics to give you enough useful information to then get to Windows 10, if that makes sense. It's also designed much more around that in-place upgrade methodology, so taking 7 to 10, because then it's identifying the application blockers and so on, whereas we don't have to worry as much about that because we're targeting application needs and versions that will just go directly onto Windows 10. So good tool set, takes a lot of effort, and it should be used, and once you put the effort in on that first time, it's better for that ongoing process, and absolutely should be something that's thought around for the ongoing process, but not necessarily for a 7 to 10 migration at this point in the process.
Yeah, I think reinforcing that is the views that you used to have in the upgrade analytics were very much designed for that purpose. Desktop analytics, although a lot of the data resides within the logs it pulls, it resides within the logs it pulls. It doesn't really present it in a usable format. So it is a lot of effort, but also skilled effort as well, which can be quite prohibitive to being able to actually make it an effective tool for a 7 to 10 now. Useful for ongoing aspects, certainly, but 7 to 10, unless you're highly experienced in being able to understand the log analytics query language and other bits and pieces, it's not the best tool to be able to support you, is probably the short answer.
My life in Power BI at the moment, desktop analytics.
Absolutely. Well, so just being conscious of time, and thank you for those. We've got still most everyone with us. We're just going to kind of wrap up and close out in terms of the conversation. So, just as a point, as I mentioned earlier on in the process, we do want to look to try and support you, and this again is just trying to share information to hopefully help any moving part of your actual program. We'll want to look to make available to everyone a template project plan. This isn't necessarily designed to be your silver bullet project plan, but something that will hopefully kind of help you more quickly get to a view and a plan that will allow you to progress forwards, as well as I mentioned those kind of 4 communications that we would kind of recommend for customers or anyone to be basically in the current kind of situation and timing of project delivery, and to help you again a little bit just have a leg up relevant to the road ahead. So we will make those available. The intention is to probably be making those available from Monday, so we'll send a note out to all, and obviously you'll be able to essentially be able to get access to those. If, of course, there is assistance that you do feel that you would like on any of the moving parts or you want to discuss further, then please just reach out to either a Power On Account team member or ourselves in general, and we'll certainly be happy to either give some more individual guidance or, of course, we can actually help. And if there is a commercial discussion to be had, like I say, this is no obligations type of things, then just through your awareness, we can also kind of support through all the G-Cloud frameworks and things like that, which just make it easy, kind of direct award options for a lot of the Windows 10 Accelerate work that we do. So just makes it easier for you to be able to navigate through some of the usual kind of business red tape and other bits and pieces that we're needing to be done. But with that being said, just want to say, you can always get in touch with us in different ways. This recording will be made available available. But thank you very much, obviously, for your attendance today. That is the end of the session that we have. Of course, as mentioned, any questions, feel free to follow up with us as well. More than happy to kind of support, but we hope you found that useful, and thank you very much. And thanks to obviously Steve and Rhiannon as well for organising the session today. Great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.